Season 6 of the Missing Witches podcast is sponsored in part by Foxglove Farm. Go to Foxglove Farm, that's farm with a PH, like pharmacy.com, and use offer code MISSINGWITCHES when you sign up for your monthly subscription box of witchy delights. And sponsored by listeners like you. You who join our Patreon and come to our coven meetings. You who buy our book. Recommend it to your friends and review it online. We thank you. And if you love this episode, tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
As we near the end of Season 6, thank you all, as always, for riding with us. Let's get a little experimental. See, Risa and I are both very excited about this witch and the mystery and possibility of her story. But Tituba doesn't really fit our parameters, or so we thought. In considering Tituba for an episode of the Missing Witches podcast, we came upon another paradox. The kind that our non-binary universe of magic is known and unknown for. Tituba, like magic itself, is both known and unknown. She is perhaps the most famous name of the Salem witch trials, but at the same time, very, very little is known about her. She felt both too known and too unknown to dare invite her to this party. But as we make our way through this world of witches, Risa and I are getting more and more comfortable with not knowing, with giving dreams credence and myth credibility in our world building. Feelings are not facts, they say, but witches know that facts and feelings inform our perspectives, feed our perception in equal measure. What happened and how did that make you feel tells me a lot more about you, what you need, and your place in the world than just what happened. And when we get emails from y'all, it's never, "That was an interesting piece of biographical information." It's always, "Here's how that episode made me feel and think about society and my life." Then along comes Paige from House Witch, recommending Maryse Condé, a Guadeloupean author who 300 years later found herself drawn into a section of a library containing books on the Salem witch trials, and drawn further to a name, Tituba. And on Tituba's behalf, Maryse created the book I, Tituba, what Angela Davis calls Tituba's revenge. Angela wrote, "Throughout her life, Tituba recoils before the prospect of exacting revenge, for fear of becoming like those who are responsible for her misery. This transcendent revenge, the retelling of a history that is as much mine as it is hers, allows her to save herself without taking on the historical characteristics of the colonizers and slaveholders she detested." Maryse says, "Tituba and I lived for a year on the closest of terms. During our endless conversations, she told me things she had confided to nobody else. The conversations went on all the time while I was writing the novel. I had the feeling that Tituba was involved in the writing. Even when I left my pages at night in my study, I believed that she would go look at them and eventually correct what she did not like. I cannot say when we really started conversing. However, all along during my writing of the novel, I felt that she was there, that I was addressing her." We've got witches and spirits and channeled writing, a society divided by values and fears, both real and imagined, the echoing of history. It's all too juicy. So I'm going to tell you about Tituba, what little we know from her recorded testimony, some details her spirit whispered to Maryse Condé, and then Risa is going to join me in the second half of the episode to help us explode and explore the themes that arise, so we can share the juice with each other and with you. Let's start with this. Tituba may have been born in Barbados, or Colombia, or South Africa. She may have been Arawak or Taino. For real, we know almost nothing for sure. And this is why Maryse Condé's version is so compelling. She dispenses with the maybes and mights and writes in the first person, a first-hand account of not only what happened, but how it made Tituba feel. So I'm going to do the same and assume, or pretend, or believe, and share with you Maryse's version of the truth, knowing that while it might not be the truth, it is definitely a truth. Let's go forth boldly and confidently and say that Tituba was born in Barbados, to an African mother, enslaved and raped on the ship that took her. Tituba's mother, Abina, is hanged for fighting back when the plantation owner who bought her tried to do the same. Tituba, at 7 years old, is assumed to have her mother's evil, rebellious blood and is driven off the plantation by its owner to fend for herself in the woods. But she is taken in by an old medicine woman who communicates with spirits, Mama Yaya. Tituba notes that the people fear her, but they come from far and wide to seek her help. This confuses Tituba. Why fear the witch? She is a helper and a healer. Mama Yaya teaches Tituba the prayers and rites of her people. Mama Yaya taught Tituba the ways of sacrifice, blood, and milk, the healing powers of herbs, creating drugs and potions with incantations to strengthen them. Mama Yaya taught Tituba that the dead don't die. They live on when we honor them with offerings and by kneeling when we communicate with them. Around the same time that Mama Yaga exits the material world, the plantation is sold. The enslaved people who built families and communities on this land are divided up and sold. You'll recall that Tituba wasn't technically listed property, so she was able to sneak off undetected into the night, into the wilderness. And she built herself a little shack and raised animals and was never lonely because Mama Yaya had taught her how to conjure spirits. Tituba could call on Abina and Mama Yaya to be with her at any time. And wouldn't it be nice if that were the end of the story? Tituba lived happily ever after in the woods with her herbs and animals, the end. Instead, one day Tituba runs into a handsome, enslaved man named John Indian on a path, and he invites her to a dance. Tituba conjured her mothers, and their spirits advised against it. But who among us has listened to our mothers when they told us a boy wasn't good for us? Tituba went to the dance and fell desperately in love with John Indian. She did take some advice from Mama Yaya, though, and she scratched John's finger at the dance in an attempt to get a little of his blood that could be used with magic to know his true intentions, to make him love her. She scratched him and he said, "What are you doing, you little witch?" Maryse Condé writes Tituba's thoughts in that moment. He was joking, but it made me think. What is a witch? I noticed when he said the word, it was marked with disapproval. But why should that be? Why? Isn't the ability to communicate with the invisible world, to keep constant links with the dead, to care for others and heal, a superior gift of nature that inspires respect, admiration, and gratitude? Consequently, shouldn't the witch, if that's what the person who has this gift is to be called, be cherished and revered rather than feared? And this is, of course, the question that would chase Tituba throughout her life, trying to do right and being called witch in return. But she has fallen in love with John Indian and makes the decision to marry him. But if they want to live together, Tituba must give up her life of freedom. You'll recall that John Indian was enslaved, so if he and Tituba were to be a couple, Tituba would have to become a servant to John Indian's master. The slave owner was a widow. She was quite fond of John Indian and not fond of Tituba. But she allowed the marriage under the condition that Tituba would become Christian, study the Bible, recite it chapter and verse. But Tituba learning the catechism wasn't enough for old Susanna Endicott. She demanded to know, "Weren't you raised by a witch named Mama Yaya?" Tituba replied, "Witch? She took care of people and cured them." Susanna Endicott just smiled, but the kind of smile that has no joy in it. Tituba went to John Indian and told him everything. John stiffened. saying Governor Dutton had 2 slaves who had been accused of dealing with Satan burned in the square at Bridgetown. For the whites, that's what being a witch means. Tituba objects in what might be my favorite line of the whole book. Dealing with Satan? Before setting foot in this house, I didn't know who Satan was. See, Satan was and is an invention. A Molotov cocktail of a weapon that can be thrown at anyone and burst them into flames. Tituba had never heard of Satan until she was introduced to Christianity at Susanna Endicott's behest. But as Tituba learned, and many of us discover on our own journeys, her logic, her healing, her love was no match for scorn, jealousy, paranoia, and fear. You don't know the whites, John Indian told her. If she manages to get them to believe you're a witch, they'll build a stake and put you on it. So, Tituba, knowing that if she went to court she wouldn't be listened to or believed, resolved to protect herself and went deep into prayer. And so it passed that Susanna Endicott became deathly ill, but this did not stop her from seeking and finding her revenge. She sold John Indian to a failed colonial businessman, Samuel Parris, who had plans to leave the island paradise of Barbados and head to Boston, where he would be a preacher and find a parish to pay his wage. Susanna Endicott knew that Tituba was technically free, but if she wanted to stay with her love, she too would have to board the ship to America. Tituba fears Samuel Parris, and with a compassion that Maurice Condé buries deep and wide in Tituba's character, discovers she is not the only one. Tituba sees Samuel's wife, Elizabeth, as another prisoner, as a little girl child forced to share the life and bed of this terrifying man. And on the pitching, vomitous boat ride north, the two become close. They become each other's comfort and confidants, and they both suffered Samuel's violence and screaming of damnation. Tituba wondered about all this talk of damnation. Perhaps it's because they have done so much harm to their fellow beings, to some because their skin is black, to others because their skin is red, that they have such a strong feeling of being damned. Tituba became the caregiver and a source of storytelling entertainment, not just for the parish children, but many little girls in the town. This kindness would, of course, be her undoing. She told the girls stories of the old country and tried to make them laugh, bringing what little joy she could to their lives. They commanded, "Tituba, sing us a song! Tituba, tell us a story!" And Tituba complied. One day, though, as Maurice wrote, things turned sour. One of the neighborhood girls asked, "Tituba, is it true you know everything? You see everything and can do everything? You're a witch, then?" Tituba loses her temper, shouting, "Don't use words whose meaning you don't know. Do you know what a witch really is?" And the girls in unison reply that a witch is someone who has made a pact with the devil. In the winter of 1692, Betty and Abigail, the daughter and niece of Samuel Parris, begin having fits, convulsing and screaming, blaming Tituba and her witchcraft. Between 1692 and 1693, almost 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem Village. 20 were executed, mostly women. The girls accused Tituba and 2 other women from the village, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, both disenfranchised women who shirked the rules of Puritanism. One was poor, loud, and unkempt. The other refused to give up her property when her husband died and instead married her lover. Neither attended church. Tituba maintains that a witch is a healer and a helper, that she had done no ill to the family or anyone. But her husband, John Indian, kept up the refrain that he had been telling Tituba since their days in the house of Susanna Endicott. Just survive. The only thing that is important is that we survive. A doctor was brought in to examine the girls, and when no physical evidence of illness was found, the doctor concluded that the only remaining explanation was witchcraft. Tituba was tortured until she confessed and gave testimony in court. The devil she described was a tall, thin, white man with long white hair wearing a black cloak. It's funny that no one at the time seemed to notice that Tituba's description of the devil bore a striking resemblance to Samuel Parris himself. He had beaten her and coached her, told her exactly what to say at trial. He was the devil. When she was brought to trial on May 9th, 1693, for her own crime of witchcraft, the charges against her were immediately dismissed. Tituba's usefulness as a witness had allowed her to outlive the early hysteria. By the time she was brought to trial, people were starting to think the whole panic was a big mistake. The word ignoramus was written on the back of her charges, as though to imply that the woman whose testimony had started the panic was now considered too stupid to know anything about it. Or perhaps the word ignoramus referred to her accusers. Because of her testimony, Tituba survived, but was left to rot in prison for a full year when the Parris family refused to pay her jail fees. So Tituba was bought for the price of those fees and returned to a life of slavery. The history books don't tell us who bought Tituba, but Maurice Condé does. According to Maurice's version, Tituba is purchased by a Jewish man. They become lovers. Maurice said later, there was a historian teaching at the same college, and I asked her to give me some information about the Puritans of New England. Because she was Jewish, she influenced me to show how petty the Puritans really were, how their minds were narrow, full of prejudice. The Puritans were opposed not only to the blacks, but also to the Jews. They forbade the Jews to settle in the colony of Massachusetts and forced them to go to the more liberal colony of Rhode Island. I decided to give Tituba a Jewish lover and tried to associate discrimination against the Jews with discrimination against the blacks. But, witches, we know the devil and difference were not the only things that Puritans feared. Smallpox swept through colonial New England communities regularly. Symptoms of the very contagious disease, which killed 3 out of 10 infected people, included fever and rash. Survivors were left with scars, often on their face, or sometimes became blind. Outbreaks of disease frequently heightened witchcraft suspicions, leading neighbors to view one another with distrust and anger, and launching grudges that could last for decades. One very clear example of the relationship between disease and witchcraft suspicions is the accusation of Martha Carrier during the Salem witch trials. Sometime between 1684 and 1689, Goodwife Carrier and her husband Thomas moved from Billerica to Andover. Shortly after they arrived, a smallpox outbreak began in the Carrier family, and 13 townspeople died. Among them 7 members of Carrier's family. Her father, 2 brothers, 2 nephews, 1 sister-in-law, and 1 brother-in-law. Many in the community blamed the Carrier family for the outbreak, a grievance that was not soon forgotten. In 1692, when witchcraft accusations began to spread from Salem Village across Essex County, Martha Carrier was the first person to be accused in Andover. This innocent woman, who accusers claimed the devil had promised would be the queen in hell, was hanged on August 19th, 1692. In I, Tituba, our witch regains her freedom when her Jewish home is burned to the ground by puritanical forces of hate, and she returns at long last to her island home, Barbados, to find her little shack in the woods still standing. She falls in love with a man who is planning a slave revolt, and Tituba is killed when colonists violently shut the revolution down. Maurice Condé said, "Writing Tituba was an opportunity to express my feelings about present-day America. I wanted to imply that, in terms of narrow-mindedness, hypocrisy, and racism, little has changed since the days of the Puritans." And I think that's what Risa and I are doing with the Missing Witches project. These stories don't exist in a vacuum. They inform our present, shape our culture, and point to the foibles of ignorami and modern life. So let's have Risa join us now. Ad break and
ad break, witches.
These ad breaks are sponsored by Missing Witches. We love you if you love us and you want to support us. There are lots of ways that you can do that. One of my personal favorites is our Patreon. There's always something going on the message board there, but specifically we do a monthly chat with those of our patrons who choose to join us. And it has been so rewarding for me, Risa. I think you can say the same thing.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just come join us. You'll see. You'll just be like, oh, I knew when I started listening to this podcast that I found my witch best friends, and there must be like a badass gang of them out there gathering somewhere in the dark. And you were right. And it's on Patreon. And our Patreon is pay what you can. So it's not like there's a tiered system or whatever. If you can afford $1 a month or whatever else, we will welcome you with open arms. And yeah, our Patreon circles, we just learn from each other, and they're rad, and you should come.
Yeah. And another excellent and exciting and thrilling to even say out loud way that you can support us is by buying our book, Missing Witches.
Oh yeah.
You can get a paper copy if you're like me and you like to fuck a book up when you read it with a lot of
same.
I like to dog ear. I have like a sigil system that I use to annotate my books, but also like a lot of times it just has to be an ebook because I know I'm going to want to search things. Sometimes I like an ebook. Also, it's available as an audio book, which Risa and I narrated ourselves. There are musical versions of the carols. Those are two great ways you can support us, through Patreon, through buying our book. You can review our book on your podcast, on your blog, on your social media, on Goodreads, on Amazon. And if you really love this episode, you can tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches. So I'm so glad that you could jump in on this, Risa, because, we don't know anything about Tituba, but the story made me think about so many different things. And so many of them I just wanted to talk to you about, and maybe our listeners can chime in and email us with some of your ideas about this too, because we're creating history with this one.
Yeah. I think I really relate to this idea of channeled history, and it seemed like it came up all season long. And then when we did this Samhain event, which you guys will hear the recording of on the 31st, when Carol Padberg was saying, there's a reason that people are so fascinated with mushrooms right now. Like, your job right now is to listen, because I think, as she said it, like the winged ones and the tree ones and the ones who are no longer breathing are trying very hard right now to reach you. I feel a lot of that in this season, that there were people whose stories we're telling who were really good at listening, and that being a witch is learning about listening in different parts of your body and listening to different parts of the world.
Yeah,
and I think
paying
that's
attention.
What it just kept coming up.
Yeah. How we pay attention, what we pay attention to. I think there's some element of that in all of the stories that we shared this season, for sure. And maybe there's some element of that in all stories, period. But specifically, I mean, Maurice Condé claims that Tituba was her co-author on this book, I Tituba. I've never experienced anything like that. Like, certainly sometimes I've been writing about a witch and maybe there was like a small coincidence, or a particular animal showed up in my yard or something like that, and I thought, oh, this is wonderful, we're connected. But I certainly have never had such a specific guide in that way. I mean, once again, I've talked about this on the podcast before. Like, I've never had a ghost encounter, but
Yeah.
many people that I love and trust, you know, who I have no reason to question their honesty or their sanity, you know, have had these encounters. I'm not cynical about it. It just has never happened to me. So
Yeah.
maybe that's part of it, you know. I haven't had that ghost muse in the way that some people have.
Yeah. I don't know. I've had moments writing about witches where I felt very strongly like, we don't know this or that, but I think it's this. Like, and there's no reason for me to think that. It's just the when I look at the evidence and the rhetoric and the language, I'm not saying I'm right or that I have access to a spirit co-author, but something in me goes, I think it's this. And I'm going to tell you that because that's what this kind of history is. You know, we're out beyond the edges of the archives. We're trying to find stories, you know. So it matters. It just like you said in the beautiful piece you wrote about Tituba, like, part of what we're doing is not just these are the facts, but these are how I feel about the facts, you know.
Yeah. And I know you and I have both had the experience of like doing some writing and then going back to edit and finding a paragraph and being like, oh, don't remember writing this at all. This is great stuff.
Absolutely.
You know. So
yeah, absolutely.
I do have to wonder about that, you know, as a channeled thing. I mean, it doesn't appear to be coming from me in that moment if I don't even remember constructing it. So
no, I remember I think it was my dad told me this, and it might have been a quote or it might just be something he says. Like, a lot of things with my dad are like that. I think my dad's a bit of like a Pythia, a bit of like a channeling spirit sometimes. But he says the difference between a writer and everybody else is that a writer gets up and writes it down. And so I've always had that in my head, like, if you want to be a writer, I know you're tired, but you hear that phrase chiming now, then you got to get up and write it down. You know, you got to put it in your phone or scroll it across something, like, and that has been like a modus operandi for me. It's like, you gotta crawl yourself kicking and screaming, even if the baby just went to bed. If you hear that paragraph chiming in your head that you were looking for, that's the conclusion to the piece, then either you write it down or you're not writing.
yeah.
And like, to be a writer, you're a transcriber. You're writing down, where do these configurations of things even come from? You know, I feel like the electrical networks in my brain are just sort of like running their fingers through each other quietly in the background, and then they're like, here you go, try this.
and for me, there's something definitely about that liminal space between awake and asleep. And I know I will convince myself, oh, you'll remember in the morning. You'll remember in the morning. And now I know better. Now I'm 44 years old. I know I'm not going to remember in the morning. So at this point in my life, like, I make sure, again, even like you say, like, even if it's a point form on my notepad, on my phone, whatever, like.
Yeah, that's so funny. You said it in exactly the same words that Nadra Niddle said in our interview for the Toni Morrison piece that came out this week. And it was so unexpected. You know, I'm talking to this like activist, researcher, writer about her research into Toni Morrison, and she starts talking about channeled work and, like, for her, you know, being half asleep and seeking an answer to something and then it coming. And I was like, wow, this whole season is about this. It's about how we reconnect to this. Yeah, I just keep thinking about mushrooms.
Yeah. Come back, listeners, for Sunday's episode where you'll hear more about mushrooms for sure.
Okay, I did have a quote though. Can I read it for you for this episode?
Yes.
Because I've been thinking about this piece from Entangled Life, which is a mushroom book that I know a lot of people are reading this year, and I'm reading as well. And so the scientist who wrote this book, okay, he says two things that made me think of you. One of them I have a quote for, and the other one I'll just tell you, because it resonates with or chimes with or runs down mycelial networks to something we wrote about in the very first season of Missing Witches with Ipsita, Lori Chakravarty, where she talks about how magicians and witches were related at some point, and that witches sometimes would use sleight of hand or illusion to shock the mind, to open the mind, to do, then let their healing work come into like a more open space or whatever. And then this like scientist academic writing about mushrooms and fungi says the exact same thing in the introduction to his book. He says he goes to see like a magician, a friend, do their work. And after they leave, this couple who'd been at the show leaves the show and goes outside and comes back inside freaking out. And they're like, the sky is like pink and orange and trippy purples and blues, and like we're worried that someone slipped us something. They check the drinks, you know, and they make sure it's not true. And then the magician is like, so this actually happens a lot. And what happens is that when you've seen something that shakes your expectation of what you're going to see, of your reality, your brain stops filling in your vision with quick templates for a little while. It's trying to save you time all the time. So it's like, sky is blue, don't worry, those buildings are like this. It fills in sketches. But when it's astonished, open for a bit, and it's like, whoa, that magician just bent spoons or whatever, read my mind, then the brain goes, well, I can't put in these templates anymore. And then suddenly you see the sky in a way you've never fucking seen the sky, right? Which is so perfect, and I can't believe it's in this book. And then he describes participating in this research trial where academics who are dealing with a problem that they want to try to find a solution to are invited to do LSD with a guide. And, you know, he studies fungi. LSD is originally derived from a fungi. He's like, sign me up, why not? So then he says, I lay on the hospital bed with my eyes closed and I wondered what it was like to be a fungus. I found myself underground, surrounded by growing tips, surging across one another. Schools of globular animals grazing, plant roots in their hustle, the wild west of the soil, all those bandits, brigands, loners, crapshooters. The soil was a horizonless external gut. Digestion and salvage everywhere, flocks of bacteria surfing on waves of electrical charge, chemical weather systems, subterranean highways, slimy, infective embrace, seething, intimate contact on all sides. As I followed a fungal hypha into a cavernous root, I was struck by the sanctuary it offered. Very few other types of fungi were present, certainly no worms or insects. There was less bustle and hassle. It was a haven I could imagine paying for. Perhaps that was what the blue flowers offered, the fungi, in return for the nutritional support. Shelter from the storm. I make no claims about the factual validity of these visions. They are at best plausible and at worst delirious nonsense, not even wrong. Nonetheless, I learned a valuable lesson. The way I had grown accustomed to thinking about fungi involved abstract interactions between organisms that actually looked like the diagrams school teachers drew on the board, semi-automatic entities that behaved according to an early 90s Game Boy logic. However, the LSD had forced me to admit that I had an imagination, and I now saw fungi differently. I wanted to understand fungi not by reducing them to ticking, spinning, bleeping mechanisms as we so often do. Rather, I wanted to let these organisms lure me out of my well-worn patterns of thought, to imagine the possibilities they face, to let them press against the limits of my understanding, to give myself permission to be amazed and confused by their entangled lives. And I've said this in other episodes this season, I keep thinking about this idea that when we're in the lunar mind, as Monica Cho says, or we're in this liminal space, or we're out of the sort of action control part of the brain with LSD or with ritual, we can sort of release our control for a little bit and hear each other. And maybe part of the ancestors we hear are, you know, the fungi that we all emerge from, that is the reason we have an atmosphere, and or, you know, all of the life that came before us that is buried in the ground.
I was thinking of so many things as you were talking and reading. One specifically is that this idea of like bending our minds out of our brains filling in the blanks. And one of the most exciting examples of this to me is that like things always can't be done until they are, and then many people do them. Like so many examples in sports. I can't remember. Sports fans, email us, missingwitches@gmail.com. But it's something
The quadruple jump in
yeah,
skating or whatever. Yeah,
exactly.
yes,
Yeah,
yes, so many.
the 4 minute mile skateboarding, it was like the 7:20, and then as soon as one person does it, then suddenly like the record's getting broken again and again and again. There's something that is just like in our minds about our capabilities, and these well-worn paths that, like you say, you know, not necessarily using drugs, but just like other methods of changing our perception, our perspective, and whether it's sleight of hand or just listening differently, paying attention in different ways.
And we have to resist the ways that that's happening in damaging and controlling ways all around us. You know, that's what gaslighting is. It's a fucking, and I've experienced it. You know, it's like it's a fucking spell that tells you reality is one way. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, and all I could think was, I feel like a robot that's been turned off. I feel like a machine that's been turned off. Like I couldn't act. I was totally, totally paralyzed when I was at my peak of being controlled by another person, distorting reality. And so I have complete understanding of what a spell is, because I was under one from what I don't know what the word magic means, but I was under one, you know, and it wasn't magic. It was just manipulation. It was power of words. It was distorting reality.
Yeah. And I mean, that manipulation, for better or for worse, is what magic is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what we talk about, consent and care. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's sort of this whole thing with, you know, being fed a reality and being forced to accept it. You know, we find it also, you know, in our lives, specifically in Tituba, where we have this notion of what it means to be a witch. And then we have other people telling us, no, it means this, it's bad, it's wrong, it's evil, it's ugly, it's, you know, unlovable. And these are the messages that we contend with. And once again, for a lot of people, those are informing their reality, their decision making in terms of, you know, coming out of the broom closet with their friends and family. There are so many ways that these, there's in conversation with this one friend of mine, I'm always saying, like, the laws of man are not the laws of physics. We can break them. We can break them, and chances are, like, nothing bad is going to happen, you know?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's, like, you know, obvious stuff, like hurting people and that kind of thing that's off the table in terms of rule breaking. Some rules are rules for a reason, but the stuff a bit like this is how you have to present yourself.
Right. Yeah. This is what healing means. Yeah, so much stuff. And so I would tell the story about Tituba. But I'll report back what I get more other people's memories of this. But it was so funny that we were talking about Tituba, and I was talking to some of my friends, my circle of women friends that I've known since grade 7, since the beginning of high school here in Quebec, and they were like, "Yeah, well, we've read more Tituba." Like, what are you talking about? We read more Tituba. It's like, yeah, we've read Tituba in French. We read it in French class, grade 9. You did a presentation on it where you made us all do a seance. We did a seance in our private Catholic girls' school, 200-year-old school, full of stories of hauntings. Turned out the lights, lit candles, all the little girls in their uniforms. The French teacher, like, perfect, exactly. This
Parce que
exactly
c'était
what I planned.
Ouais, c'était en français,
Yeah,
alors.
yeah. We read the original French, and we summoned Tituba. I don't remember. I remember the sort of feeling of like a windy day in the dark, and I remember what classroom it was in. But that's all I remember. I didn't even remember we'd read that book.
But they remembered. So perhaps you were entranced, and perhaps this is why you don't remember. Do they
I certainly
remember?
fainted a lot at that time, and I had a lot of strange stories to tell. Yeah, I don't know. Tituba.
Yeah, so many mysteries. Like we
So,
literally don't know anything. There's another book that's called like Tituba or the Reluctant Witch, and
mm,
it's just like maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe, and it's so well researched, but it's impenetrable because everything is
yeah,
like maybe it happened like this, and maybe it was this, and maybe it
right.
was this, and you're just like, you haven't helped me at all.
You're right. But how fascinating, right? That at the core of this like most like iconic story of witch hunt, there's this missing indigenous healer,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. She disappeared
Yeah.
into the ether, as it were, and I think that's part of the wonderful mystery of her is that she belongs to anyone not white. Anyone can sort of
Yeah.
imagine that they are her descendant, and that again is sort of the uncarved block of our
Mm-hmm.
spiritual ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's nicer, and maybe that is part of her legacy is that it's nicer not to know.
Yeah. That's like Marina Maguire was saying in that interview, those lives that exist out beyond the edges of the archives. They
Mm-hmm.
can't be contained by them.
Mm-hmm.
Archives can just be these lists of death, or lists of people, property bought and sold, but some people were just beyond the edges. Or, like in like Nadra was saying in Toni Morrison's story, and in this like well-believed mythology that there was of the hundreds of thousands of people that didn't make it on the boats between Africa and the United States, like some of those people just flew away.
Yeah.
Some of those people just chose not to come. Some of those people flew away. They're out beyond the edges of the archives. Yeah, I think Aitituba is a witch for those stories for sure, and so very much a witch for this Samhain time, that we're close to now, we're approaching,
Yeah.
and I
And
think it's just about listening, right? Like that's the message I keep getting right now. It's like be still, stop controlling everything, hold some dirt, listen for a little bit.
I also got like a major tickled pink thrill when I was reading that Angela Davis introduction when she called it Tituba's Revenge.
Yeah.
And I got so tickled. We talk a lot about, this project and how we're honoring these witches and their stories and our stories and untold stories, but hadn't really framed it in my mind as like an act of vengeance. And now I'm like really excited about adding that sort of that aspect to
Mm,
the idea, like, because again, I don't think there's anybody that we have profiled, living or dead, contemporary or historical, who wasn't marginalized, who didn't have reason to take revenge on society in some way or another. And I love, Angela
mm,
Davis, I think, called it like a transcendent revenge. To
mhm,
didn't want to be horrible like the people that she met, and so she did it this way. you know
mhm.
but you have to believe in order to not be like vengeful in this lifetime. I guess you have to believe that there is like a transcendent opportunity. To believe in that, you have to believe that you're capable of legacy after your
Mhm,
material life has ended,
mhm,
which again is like an interesting notion at this time of year, confronting our own mortality and trying to accept a notion of immortality. you know
mhm.
for me, immortality is harder to accept than mortality, I think. I'm working on it.
Did you ever imagine your own funeral, like when you were growing up? Did you ever were you someone who did that?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm morbid. I was a morbid. I wasn't sullen, but I was morbid for sure. I mean, are there people who haven't imagined their own funeral? For sure. I've been
I don't know. I can't
telling
imagine.
my friends, like, this is the song I want played at my funeral, for example. Like, I've had that stuff
Mm-hmm.
set since I was like 15 or whatever,
Tanu,
you know. Yeah, yeah.
ta-
And I might change it at some point, but I think it's like it's solid. It's a solid
I
choice.
think mine's from the same album. It's Wildflower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
wildflowers. Thanks
yeah.
for all you wouldn't think of it as a funeral dirges album. People,
Now you
here
will.
we are.
You're welcome, everyone. Oh.
What do we make of the fact that it was in Maurice Condé's telling? I should preface, I guess. Um, why was it always love that got Tituba into trouble? You know, why did Maurice choose to tell it this way?
Mm.
And what do we think about the fact that her compassionate acts got her into trouble, and what saved her life was that one, you know, lie of self-preservation? And
Mm.
what do we make of that in our own lives? How do we think when we know a story like this where compassion and love was the bringer of harm and the lie was
Right.
the release into freedom?
I don't know, but I am a firm believer in the setting of boundaries, in the the carving out of space for yourself, in taking what you need, not waiting for it to be given, in not pouring all of yourself out until you disappear. I believe in cutting people off who are cruel to you, even if you might have thought you owed them something. I believe I believe in protecting your power and your energy. And I think it's interesting that a story like that about, it reminds me of other stories we've told about witches selling or looking for a potion for good love, in a time when that would guarantee you safety, and I do think for like marginalized, sold, endangered people, women, queer people, that like when you've been like fucked over and brutalized, like there's just a most profound need for safety. And so love seems like it can offer that. We look for like a hand that can pull us out. But I think that can be dangerous, like we to be really careful about whose hands we trust and who we trust with our bodies and selves and our power, and draw firm boundaries and be really careful who we let in.
Love seems to be this like great rationalizer of bonkers choices, like if you say
Mm,
oh, he did this and that, and it's like, oh, why did he do that? And he's like, oh, he met a girl, and everyone's like, oh, okay. It's just like
mm,
we sort of expect ourselves and each other to do crazy things for love, but that's sort of the
mm,
only acceptable place
yeah.
for that. And is it just because like we don't understand love, so we can't explain it, and when love is the explanation, we just can't take it any further than that?
Mm, yeah. Or we recognize in ourselves that like that feeling of like love or infatuation or possible safety or possible meetingness, whatever, that throws us for a loop. That it upturns our reality. And so I think that it also makes us more vulnerable, you know, that we're like, this person is astonishing and beautiful and they like me. And so everything I thought about me was wrong and everything I thought about the world is brand new, you know. That can be like, I think that can be a really powerful place of magic. I mean, magic is about like, you know, drawing in, building up your energy, building up your power. But first making a circle of safety around you, drawing in, building up your energy, your power, and focusing your will, you know, and learning what your will really is so that you can focus it. And love is definitely, and sex is definitely a way of building up that fucking energy and that power, you know, and can be a wild way of channeling it. But I think, you know, using sex for world-changing magic is totally possible, but I think it's also a way that we can get real badly hurt, so we gotta be careful.
Yeah. My thinking, everything is a neutral tool, and it's not until it's in our hands that it's, going to be used for good or
Yes.
for bad. And let's go back to the title of this episode, and I think both of our answer is no, but let's maybe expand on the no. Do you know what a witch really is?
No.
No.
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to give one definition for that. I sort
Yeah.
of refuse to give a definition for that. People keep asking me, people in my family, so do you identify as a witch? What does that mean for you? You know, I'll talk your ear off about it because that's what I do. But I don't want a boundary set around that particular word. I like Donna Haraway's idea that it matters what thoughts we use to think other thoughts and what stories we use to build worlds. And I like the word witch, and I want to use it to build worlds with and tell stories with, but I don't want it to be hemmed in right now.
Someone came up with this question in one of our other recent conversations about, incorporating people who don't self-identify, non-like-minded. And I think, for me, the number one thing that I think of is just like not being a fucking gatekeeper, not being like, oh, you like this band, name 10 of the records, like, fuck off with your bullshit. Like, no, I don't have the tarot memorized. Yes, I'm a professional witch. I don't have the tarot memorized. I'm sorry, listeners. I understand if that I lack credibility now, but like I'm just not a good memorizer, or whatever it is. Like I think that do you know what a witch really is was one of the standout lines to me in the book, because it's a question mark, it's not an exclamation point, it's a question mark. And I think that that's the investigation, right? Like, I think I know more than before we started this project, but also it's that sort of like, the expanded version of the well of knowledge. I used to think that I understood what was in the well, and now I understand that it's an infinite ocean,
Oh, totally. I go back to Pamela Grossman's show me your ideas about witches and I'll show you your ideas about women.
Yeah.
That's core to my definition of what a witch is.
Yeah.
How the fuck do you think about women? How do you think about yourself? How do you think about women? I'll tell you how you think about witches. And vice versa. And I go back to Ipsita Roy Chakravarti, every strong woman is a witch and all are hunted. Those are core to my definition. And I look at my own life, I'm like, I don't need that word all the time. I'm very comfortable slipping in and out of that word, any identity. I'm comfortable slipping in and out of most spaces. But I know I've always been able to connect with people and see a moment of magic emerge between us, and then do things that I now and have always considered spell or ritual that can make a moment heightened and like special and otherworldly, and like where things can come in, you know. I remember a friend being like, God, you just make these days like what? Because we would, you know, and it's not just me. I know women, I know people who do that, who can take a day, who can take a moment, and suddenly it's like the leaves are sparkling and you're drawing with chalk and you've made like some sort of special concoction, and like you just are willing to, in that moment, be full of joy and potential. And that to me is core to my definition of witch and the witches I've known, because they'll look at the present and be like, right now this thing can be, you know. And that's been like core to my friendship with you. It's funny when you were talking about that you don't believe in gatekeeping. Yeah, that is so core to my relationship with you, because if listeners, if you could see Amy right now, she's got like a wall of records behind her. You can imagine the first times we hung out, you know, she's just like, you know, Amy's sort of a powerful artist presence. I am what I am, but I am in my own right. But I walked into her space and, you know, we were playing music together, we're hanging out, and she's asking me if I know this song or that song, and I don't know it. And I'm like apologizing, and she's like, oh, fuck, I'm too fucking old to think that I know all the music, or that you should. Like, she's like, I'm too old for that kind of gatekeeping. I don't give a fuck if you haven't heard a song. I get to tell you the song. Tell me your songs. It's infinite. Like, and everything exploded open. And
yeah, I remember having those feelings when I was like 14 or 15, and like there was like maybe a 6-month period in my life where I would pretend to know something that I didn't know.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, I mean, now I first of all, it's hard and I'm uncomfortable because I'm having like weaving a web of lies with something I don't know.
That's no fun. I can't maintain that.
You know,
nobody got time for that.
I'm not learning about the thing. If I had just said, no, tell me about it, then, you know, again, we could have engaged. And here's the real thing. You can't have heard all the songs. You can't.
You just can't.
I don't care how wicked your record collection is or how much Spotify premium you burn. You can't. It is impossible. So, I mean, once again, the idea of gatekeeping for someone who is unable to do the impossible seems like a real waste of time to me. You keep a lot of people out that way.
Yeah.
So, but
that's so boring.
Yeah, and magic too. I mean, I think a lot of people like rules. They like things to be black and white because they need to know what they are doing is right. And if you can tell them it's this and it's that, and you know, it's the same thing in other religions as it is, you know, in witchcraft or in the occult or in magic, where and some people get real mad. You know, they're like, I spent years studying this, and it's kind of like, how dare you waltz in here, you know, with your experimental improvisational ideas. And I don't know, to me there's room for both. I like some from column A and some from column B for sure. I like to have like a context for what I'm doing, you know, historical and social context, so I understand the words that I'm using or the tools that I'm using, or you know. I think both of us were very like, oh, you know, you get into witchcraft, especially when you're younger, but maybe not. And you get really into like the accoutrements, you know, the this and the that. And for sure, I have like a mortar and pestle with like a pentagram engraved on it, and probably like some unethically mined crystals in my collection, because you don't know, and you're just excited and you're not thinking about it. So again, I like to have a lot of joie de vivre in my magic, but it definitely has to be rooted in that listening, like the paying attention, you know, that you specifically have been talking about tonight, that like very rooted, I think, paying of attention.
Rooted listening and learning. Like, I think there's a difference between being like you can't come in here unless you already know everything, versus like, to play with us, it's important to have an attitude of listening and learning. I think those are different kinds of gatekeeping.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's just it's apparent that there are an infinite, ways of knowing and infinite forms of intellect and infinite things. Again, magic, the universe, molecules, mushrooms, that you can't have heard all the songs. Whether the songs, if you think of them as, scientific, journals or
Yeah.
this study or that, author, thinker, thought, maker, whatever.
Yeah.
You can't know everything. So the idea of closing the
Yeah.
door to anyone, once again, like anyone who's not like actively bringing harm or, trolling
Yeah.
with harm. We have to draw the line somewhere. You were talking about boundaries, and I think that, trolling with harm is a good place to close the gate. But, beyond that, everybody has something literally everyone has something to teach me,
Yeah.
And that's what's been so great about our Patreon coven, is that you and I are sort of the leaders by default. But like everyone who comes is so fascinating to me, and I'm like, every single person has like their own thing or their own niche or their own value system or way of looking at the world or at this idea, and it just like, it's like heart and soul and mind, and it just,
they are in it, they are living it. There's so much wisdom and experience there. People out in the woods building their own houses, people crafting a path from a very traditional religion into a witchcraft that feels more at home to them. I mean, people trying to figure out how to be activists in a way that feels authentic. I mean, people are in it and so open. I know our Patreon is amazing. I want to go back to this piece from your piece about Tituba, and maybe this could be our closing rant or not, but this crazy idea, this interesting fact that like the witch hunts overlap or like emerge directly from pandemic fear.
Yes, this was like one of those, the Mark Twain quote, like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think it was Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I was like, interesting. I heard a rhyme in that for sure.
So the origin of the smallpox vaccine is the smallpox vaccine, as it like kind of emerged and came to be known, was like a slaveholder being taught a practice from a slave from what they think now is like Guinea, I think, who taught a slaveholder like a long-standing practice of taking the smallpox lesions, taking the material from them and introducing them in, like, pricking people with it so that they would get hopefully a mild version of smallpox and then they would be safe from it. Like, that's where our idea of vaccines comes from. It is this like healer knowledge from a brutalized and enslaved culture, which is super fascinating. And then there's this history over and over and over again of like forcibly vaccinating communities of color without telling them. Like, there's this like tension around race. But I didn't know that piece about the witch hunt starting kind of directly from, what's her name, Carrière or something, who infected people with smallpox and then was accused of being a witch. Which it makes sense, like, you're terrified and you got sick and they got sick. And so you blame supernatural elements or something.
But I mean, this is the question. It's like, were they afraid that she was the devil, or did they just see an opportunity to take revenge on the person that they thought had made their village sick? And so they used, again, like whatever brick was around to throw. And that's, I don't know, but again, like in this rhyme of our contemporary society, like, is this what we're doing? Is this just the devil? And so we're, you know, Sylvia Federici talks about this too, about this witch hunt notionally being a way to separate people, being a way to make you not trust your neighbor because they could be a witch. And again, this is like, we live in pandemic times. Like we're coming up on 2 years almost in this, like, and it's that same feeling of like, you feel like you can't trust anybody and anybody could be devil worshipping. And so you need to make them the enemy. You need to make whoever is not, doesn't have your same values, or whoever you're afraid of, you know, becomes this Satan, this boogeyman, you know, of an enemy. And it's amazing to me how fear always seems to turn to rage and hate. That's something that I am still trying to wrap my head around, you know.
It's so guttural. I mean, I have felt that too, like in people I'm close with or have been close with, deciding that they can't be vaccinated, that their fear is too strong. And my initial reaction, and my long tail reaction of just, how could you put us at risk? Like, how could you put our community at risk? How fucking could you, you know? And I felt the rage, like and the sense of betrayal, and I felt the fear as anger thing for sure.
I saw a post that I think was the crux of it. You know, this man posted, my distrust of government is stronger than my love of people, basically. And, you know, that just makes me so fucking sad, because that to me, like, y'all know me, I'm like an 80s punk. I don't trust the government. I don't fucking trust pharmaceutical companies. I don't trust none of y'all motherfuckers. You know? But my distrust of these things is not as strong as my desire to do what I can, even in the off chance that, you know, it's not a miracle. You know, obviously, like, it's not stronger than that. It's just not strong.
Yeah. And just, I mean, following the researchers and the story of the scientists, women scientists, people of color, all around the world who worked to develop that vaccine. I mean, I went, followed them on Twitter. Like, I found the individual people, I found the stories, the sort of history as it was being written. Like, I was not somebody who just believed wholeheartedly because I saw it on the news that it was what I should do, you know. Like, I'm not somebody who's comfortable doing what the prime minister tells me to do on the news, but like, I nerd out and I watched what, from my point of view, was the greatest collaboration that humanity has ever done. You know, it was the fastest. You know, people were dying and they saw how rapidly this could get out of control. And so borders were erased. Money was no issue. Everybody knew, like, the economy can't survive if this thing gets out of control. And so it was the biggest international open source, to a degree, collaboration that we've ever done. And that's why this research that started 10 years ago after SARS, and planning, and they had a fairly good idea of what coronavirus would be like and how they would need to get it. And when they got the call, it was now. It was a spectacular act of collaboration. To me, it's like, that's beyond hopeful. Sign me up. And then I see the old people lining up to get the vaccine after they've been scared in their homes for a year. And I'm like, this is a beautiful thing we're doing together. You know, this is a great demon we're facing together. So, but at the same time, I have close friends now who don't, just crying, saying, I feel like I'm having a breakdown, but I can't do it. I don't know why I can't do it. I just can't do it. And they're increasingly isolated. And I mean, I'm not that there for them either because I'm scared. But I'm trying to have a heart that's open to that perspective too, you know. Like they're smart anarchist punk women who are like, I'm scared, you know. So I don't know.
And I mean, this is
a rambly tirade about it.
this is the thing, and this is why, you know, we call ourselves anti-capitalist, and, you know, we call ourselves resistors. Is because we know, you know, we don't have the luxury of not knowing how messed up the system is. You know, we know. We know. And capitalism has created this society and like ridden and driven people so hard that they're literally like, I can't do anything. I can't take this thing because that's the level of distrust that you've created in our relationship, like my relationship with capitalism. Yes. You know, that's the level of distrust that our society has created, that people are like risking their relationships, risking their jobs because they don't trust you that much, you being the government, not you, Risa. But yeah, I mean, that's crazy, you know, to be like aware that like that we've been given enough evidence that like the system doesn't necessarily have our backs. And then it's the boy who cried wolf, right? But the opposite. Yeah. It's like the system that cried candy, you know? Yeah. You're like, I don't know, these other times it was a wolf, it wasn't candy. And now the candy is here and we're like, I don't know. It was a wolf last time.
I don't know what you're talking about because it's total chaos all the time. So I don't know if I want your fucking candy. Can't even candy while lighting my house on fire. Why would I take that candy?
You know? So again, like, I but that's why to me, like, it makes me sad above anything, you know?
It makes me sad too. I mean, I think for me, it's important to remember to not disappear the individual labor and care in the great pressure and pressure wash of capitalism. Like there are individual scientists. We talk about big pharma, and so we erase these individual vaccine researchers who were working these insane hours trying to save their parents too, you know. We erase the people, and that is a mistake because every one of those people is an opportunity for change. And I think when we erase each other, that's a bad emergent energy. That's a bad spell, you know.
Yeah. I mean, to tie it back in, and maybe this will be the bow that ties the whole thing together, is this, like, we're creating devils, you know. We are taking like human phenomenon and just making devils out of them, because then you can just put, well, the devil made me do it, or he's like that because of the devil, or she's like that, you know. Insert whether you can define devil however you want, but in this rhyming of history, you know, we can't just create great mythical beasts to take on all the burden of our critical thinking, no matter which side we're on, you know.
That's it. Yeah. Don't create mythical beasts to take on the burden of your critical thinking. That's the catchphrase.
I'm glad that we're recording this because that means I don't have to write it down. But yeah, I mean, whether we're witch hunting in the 1600s or whether we're, having rage outs in fucking Walmart in 2021, like, just don't create some mythical beast to take on the burden of your critical thinking.
We love you, listeners.
We
Thanks
love
for
you
being
so
with
much.
us.
Thank you for joining all this on this wild ride. We love you so much. Please email us. Like, everything that we say, it ends in a question mark. So if you have answers, always let us know at missingwitches@gmail.com.
Oh, and I will make one more plug for this. Coming up later this year, we will do an episode where we just read and respond to listener email. We won't share anybody's real names, but we've never done that. We've gotten incredible letters. Some of them we haven't answered because they were too emotional or because we were too swallowed by life, but we're going to dig through, find some of the ones that really shook us and share them with you guys. So between now and then, send us your letters and maybe you'll hear them on the podcast.
We love you. Thanks for joining us, as always.
You must be a witch.
Season 6 of the Missing Witches podcast is sponsored in part by Foxglove Farm. Go to Foxglove Farm, that's farm with a PH, like pharmacy.com, and use offer code MISSINGWITCHES when you sign up for your monthly subscription box of witchy delights. And sponsored by listeners like you. You who join our Patreon and come to our coven meetings. You who buy our book, recommend it to your friends, and review it online. We thank you. And if you love this episode, tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches.